Have you ever stopped to wonder who exactly are us and who are them? As in us versus them. If we must fight, shouldn't we at least know which side everyone's on? Hey, everybody, and thanks for tuning in. I'm James Pepe, and this is Pep Talks. In the war between the states, Union soldiers wore blue, while Confederates wore gray and spoke with a thick Southern drawl. The sides didn't directly mix very much, the whole Mason-Dixon line thing. So it wasn't too difficult knowing who was who. Today, however, as some of our neighbors anxiously call for another civil war, I'm struck by the thought of the various divisions amongst us and can't help but wonder how we might distinguish our enemies from our friends in such an unimaginable event. Would we divide ourselves into pro-Trump and anti-Trump camps? Would we choose sides based upon party affiliation? Perhaps we'd simply designate it a blue state versus red state battle. As difficult as it is to imagine a civil war today, it's even more difficult to imagine how we would know who to attack and who to defend. Short of actual war, however, the question of which side each of us is on in today's increasingly hostile political conflict has been a really troubling one for me. Don't misunderstand. Obviously, I get how normal it is for Americans to identify as Republicans or Democrats or independents or whatever when it comes to selecting our government representatives. It's just that I can't think of a time in my life when the conflict between sides was this strong and the animosity between fellow citizens this extreme. I suppose maybe during the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War era. That was 60 years ago, folks. Either way, it concerns me greatly, and I think it should concern you too. Look, I'm no stranger to taking sides, and I certainly don't fear the challenges of healthy competition. I've been a fierce competitor my entire life, in classrooms, on sports fields, in private business, in the halls of government, and on the trails of political campaigns. I love to compete, and I love to win. But this feels different. Since 2015, I have been outspoken in my views about Donald Trump. Though I am a lifelong Reagan Republican, I have repeatedly made clear to longtime friends, family, and strangers alike that even when I find myself in agreement with Trump's policy agenda, I cannot bring myself to support him out of strong objections to his character. In particular, his indisputable dishonesty and general lack of integrity. To be even more clear, I personally could not support anyone for public office who could not pass these basic tests. As you know by now, my conviction about this has been so strong that I actually challenged Trump for the Republican nomination in 2020. Throughout these past 10 years, I've remained engaged in the political process as a concerned citizen. My dad raised me this way, old school. Stop complaining and do something about it. His most common refrain to me was always, those who have an ability to lead have a responsibility to lead. As you can see, I take that very seriously. During that time, however, I've been repeatedly astonished by the levels of hostility I have witnessed from those who apparently cannot tolerate any criticism of Trump whatsoever, especially here on anti-social media. I guarantee you that this episode will generate numerous attacks from fellow citizens who will assume I am a liberal Democrat Biden supporter, even as I sit here calmly explaining something that I think should be both easy to understand and easy to accept. You don't have to agree with my view on Trump's character, honesty, and integrity. But once you know that's my view, it makes no sense to attack me for not being supportive of him. The flip side of that coin is this. I may not understand how anyone can see Trump as honest, trustworthy, a good person. But if somehow they do, then it takes very little to understand why they would support him and his policies. For what it's worth, it's even easier to understand the people, and there are many, who readily agree that Trump is a terrible person. But because they think all politicians are terrible, they have no problem supporting the one whose policy agenda at least most closely suits them. And what makes all of that even more interesting is that I consistently receive similar treatment from liberal Democrats, who often lose their minds when I dare to suggest that Trump is actually right about a lot of the issues. Or even if I utter a single syllable that isn't a full-throated condemnation of him. I'm especially amused when people on both sides attack me for being critical of, well, both sides. Apparently, that isn't allowed because, again, we must pick a side. We must settle for the lesser of two evils. Failing to do so is to commit the sin of moral equivalency when one side is so clearly worse than the other. Because, the other side is literally going to destroy our country. Even if you readily acknowledge that the one side is, in fact, worse, but explain that you still cannot give your approval to the other. Honestly, sometimes it feels like they're demanding you choose between Jeffrey Dahmer and Charles Manson to be your roommate at summer camp. Again, please don't misunderstand. The last thing I ever want to do is sound like I'm whining and crying about people being mean to me. Trust me, after decades in politics and several campaigns of my own, I can take it. I relay my experience only to reiterate that something about today's political climate is significantly different from the norm, which brings me back to the point about choosing sides. The anger and animosity on both sides of today's hyper-partisan divide is real, and it's more intense than it's been in decades, if not longer. More importantly, however, is the challenge it poses to all of us who look to the future with hope for reconciliation and renewal. How do we get past this? How do we bring our country back together for our own sake and for our children? As I said, I'm all for competition, including the competition of ideas that takes place every day in our public discourse. But when our civic life begins to seem more like a fight to the death, well, let's just say that I can't see how any of us can win if half of us have to lose. Think about it. We, all of us, we're family, friends, neighbors, countrymen. And for all our petty disagreements and disputes, we are bound to one another by shared allegiance and dedication to liberty, justice, and the freedom to pursue our individual ideas of happiness. So for all those reasons and more, the idealist in me desperately wants to reject the us versus them thing. I absolutely despise the notion that we must fight one another in order to move us all ahead. No matter how hard I try, however, the pragmatist in me knows that there will always be sides to be taken or rejected, and that a very real competition of ideals exists in our never-ending quest to improve our own lives as well as the world around us. So again, I return to the question. In these times of such intense division, if we are ultimately forced to choose sides, who are us and who are them? As you can tell, we've thought about that question quite a bit here at PepTalks, and we're prepared to make our case for reframing this struggle in a way that will give us the best chance to heal, reunite, and get our great nation back on track sooner rather than later. The us is what we call the CommonSense Majority. We actually dedicated our last PepTalks episode specifically to this concept. But as it is central to our mission, we continually reference it, including right here. Generally speaking, the CommonSense Majority is the 80% of us who are either completely disengaged from politics or who constantly find themselves depressingly defaulting to the lesser of two options. We are the ones who are too busy most days to even think about politics, much less get involved. If we're not hustling to pay the bills, we're scrambling to get the kids to school on time or struggling to keep up with a million daily household chores. Around the dinner table or in the bleachers at the local ballpark, we're the ones always changing the subject. When it does come to politics, however, perhaps our most defining characteristic is that we see a little bit of good and a whole lot of bad on both sides of America's partisan divide. And we recognize the practical need for compromise if we're ever to move ahead. One more thing about us, the CommonSense Majority. We're not rich and powerful or famous and influential. We're just regular, everyday folks minding our own business, trying to make our way through this world as best we can. We try not to judge, nor to tell others what to do or think or how to live. And though we are as susceptible as the next guy to the human vices of envy and resentment, the truth is we admire those who achieve success and we encourage our children to follow their example. So that's the us side of the battlefield. Now, what about them? If common sense Americans are unhappy and maybe even a bit angry about the state of our politics and dysfunctional governance, where should we aim that displeasure? Truth be told, it's an alliance of adversaries, a true axis of evil, you might say. But let's begin with the uncompromising extremists. You know who I'm talking about. They're loud, they're angry, they're obnoxious, and they're absolutely relentless. Oh, and again, they're on both sides. They're the ones who'd rather burn down the house than share the living room with anyone who disagrees with them. As the term suggests, these are the my way or the highway folks who see the world and life itself as an all or nothing, zero-sum game. For them, all issues, big or small, have only one answer, their answer. Anything else is wrong and absolutely intolerable. Sure, many of these folks will deny their unwillingness to compromise, but when you dig just a little, you'll find that compromise to them almost always means the other guy, us, should roll over and concede everything to them. And here's a crucial pep stat you should never forget. They number fewer than 20% of us, but they get 90% of the airtime, probably more, to be honest. Meanwhile, the optics of their zealous presence at rallies and marches, not to mention their reliability as donors, volunteers, and voters, has led the shameless political class to give them their undivided, ass-kissing attention. It's stunning, and yet somehow not surprising, the way these cowardly so-called leaders shudder in fear and abandon all principle, lest they provoke a challenge in the next primary election. Regardless, the point is worth repeating as often as we can here on PepTalks. The uncompromising extremists who dictate our dysfunctional politics are a small minority of America's population, fewer than 1 out of 5 of us. But here's the thing about that. Because its nature is to stir controversy and conflict, the media amplifies the fight between the far left and the far right and portrays those loud, obnoxious, uncompromising extremists on both sides as the norm, leaving the rest of us with the false impression that our nation is split evenly down the middle, 50-50, and that sooner or later we must choose one of those sides. Nothing could be further from the truth. But let's be really, really clear while we're at it. The media isn't alone when it comes to the distortion of reality. In fact, they're just one part of a larger, more pervasive entity we refer to as the corrupt power establishment. This is the other half of the axis of evil I was talking about. But before I explain what that is, let me make one other thing crystal clear. The free press is an absolutely critical component of a healthy democracy, and it has a crucial role to play in the preservation of freedom. For all its flaws, it is not the enemy of the people, and it is incredibly dangerous, irresponsible, and flat out wrong for the President of the United States to cast it as such. Now, with that said, let's talk about the corrupt power establishment for a minute. What exactly is it? Well, in the simplest of terms, it is a group of people from various walks of life who have disproportionate influence over the way the rest of us live our daily lives. Influence which they abuse in order to keep us under their thumb. More specifically, they're the politicians who sell us out by skewing every debate and legislative effort to appeal to one extreme or the other. They're the corporate titans and the ultra-wealthy who control all aspects of the economy while callously lowballing the value of our labor. They're the educators who indoctrinate our kids with the latest politically correct fads. They're the clergy who strive unceasingly to inject religious dogma into the classroom, the courts, and the halls of government, rarely content with their influence in the hearts and homes of their flocks. They're the invisible hands that control the flow of information, and too often disinformation on the internet. And again, they're the media figures on the news, on TV and in the movies, and online who manipulate us into distorted perceptions of reality. At this point, you may be thinking that I'm talking about some grand conspiracy, about the way people who fall into these categories get together on Monday morning Zoom calls from secret evil layers to plot their world domination and reinforce our subservience to them. Sorry, but no, not quite. It's not secret meetings in smoke-filled rooms. It's just a system that promotes profit without responsibility, punishes the courage to dissent, and feeds on division and distraction. And through all of that, constantly manipulates us to ensure the outcomes that serve their interests before all else. That's it. It's not a conspiracy. The rich and powerful act instinctively to first protect their wealth and control, and then to continually grow it to ensure their ability to have and do anything they want, whenever and wherever. It's very natural, actually. In fact, I'm sure most of us would do the very same thing if we were in their shoes. The private media moguls, well, they're just like everyone else in business, driven by the pressure to produce bottom line profits, which means they need eyes and ears. And that too often means resorting to the quickest and easiest ways to appeal to the most base human nature of their viewers and listeners through fear, conflict, and sensationalism. Now, as for academia and religion, they hold the masses in the palms of their hands as captive audiences every day of the week. Relentlessly, they indoctrinate generation after generation with inevitably biased perspectives and worldviews, all aimed to constantly enhance their own influence and advance their hidden agendas. So you see, without leadership to protect the rest of us, these folks just do what anyone in their positions would naturally do, given human nature and the demands of those positions. Again, they don't need to coordinate their efforts. They simply, logically end up in the same places, employing the same means, pursuing the same ends. Add it all together, and it amounts to a relatively small portion of our population exercising a hugely disproportionate amount of influence over the rest of us. And make no mistake, it goes on 24/7 in such a constant and pervasive way that we hardly even notice it. So, what makes the corrupt power establishment corrupt, you ask? Well, as I said, it's the way it institutionally prioritizes its self-interest before all else, including the everyday interests of its viewers and listeners, its students and congregants, its customers and employees, and ultimately, its constituents and fellow citizens. This is not a new phenomenon. Again, it's really a simple, logical reflection of human nature as old as civilization itself. But where in the past we've been blessed with leaders in all of these areas who found ways to balance their self-interest with the public interest, it seems like there are fewer and fewer of such people of integrity to be found today. Call it evolution, or perhaps more accurately, devolution. Politicians have methodically created a system that has detached them from the people they represent, insulating them from effective accountability and freeing them to pursue their self-serving agendas while hardly even bothering to mask their corrupt intentions. Leaders of industry and the ultra-wealthy have followed suit, emboldened by the knowledge that virtually no transgression or ethical lapse on their part will put even the slightest dent in consumers' insatiable hunger to consume. And in this age of the internet, media purveyors have fractured their industry so extensively as to create multiple realities that constantly reinforce the idea of alternative facts, where the truth can be whatever anyone wants it to be. And there's always a channel that will validate your perspective. This makes the pressure and temptation to perversely spin, overly dramatize, and constantly create fictional realities out of whole cloth both intense and irresistible. And in America's classrooms and houses of worship, the challenge to keep up with warp speed cultural change is freeing the men and women who lead vital institutions to dispense with any pretense of ethical responsibility, not only to those who sit before them seeking knowledge, wisdom, and comfort, but to the wider world that looks to education and spirituality as foundational components of a just and peaceful society. Leaders of integrity in all these areas are conspicuously absent today, having apparently caved to the age-old fear of losing their power if they dare to stand against the rising tide of expedient self-service. In other words, if you can't beat them, join them. While all that may explain the key forces at work, it doesn't quite spell out the real problem now, does it? So let me rephrase the question one more time and offer a succinct answer. How do the corrupt power establishment and uncompromising extremists work together to pervert our politics into something most of us despise? The answer is shockingly simple. In pursuit of its self-interests and by utilizing its vast arsenal of influence, the corrupt power establishment manipulates predictable, uncompromising extremists into fighting one another. Of course, the media covers every aspect of it every day as if it was the Super Bowl. In doing so, it conditions the rest of us to believe that those battles are being fought by a majority which we are powerless to resist, leaving us with the binary choice of siding with the least bad of the two, or shrugging our shoulders and trusting our fate to them. At that point, all we can do is hope against hope that maybe, just maybe, we'll get lucky and everything will work out in the end. That's really what most of us have been doing for a long time. Meanwhile, amidst the ensuing chaos, they quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, claim their victories and their spoils of profit and power, all the while telling us in no uncertain terms that we should be thankful it wasn't worse. You see, they don't need to control us with chains. They do it with algorithms, outrage, and false choices. Now, maybe you're thinking that's all a bit much. Too matrixy, perhaps? Or maybe it just hurts to think that hard about it and try to make sense of something so nonsensical. I get it. As I said, however, all of it together is really just a logical result of social and political systems that reward power and punish integrity. In the meantime, the rest of us continue to give in to the radical realism that tells us we are at their mercy, without so much as a shred of power to advance our own interests and common sense ideas about the way things should be. And in case you've forgotten, let me just remind you that realism in this context is nothing more than a fancy term to justify pessimism and the shirking of responsibility behind the excuse that there was nothing we could do. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy that we, the CommonSense Majority, fall for all too easily. But I don't buy it. Not for a second. Because I've seen what happens when common sense Americans stop believing the lie and start believing in themselves. With that, we have some important choices in front of us. For starters, you can look at the big picture and once again resign yourself to the radical realism that tells you the corrupt power establishment will always win, so why bother fighting it? Or you can wake up to the painful truth at the heart of it all, that we allow ourselves to be manipulated and controlled by believing the lie that we are powerless. And then we can turn that self-fulfilling prophecy around in our favor. In other words, it should be just as easy to believe we have power as it is to believe that we don't. I guess it is a little matrixy. Blue pill, red pill. Anyway, my point is that we do have the power to change things. The numbers don't lie. Will we have to trust and have faith in that belief, even when we don't instantly get the results we want? Of course, Rome wasn't built in a day, and it's taken America's corrupt power establishment centuries to pervert it to their advantage. So it's going to take a minute to turn it around. Look, they tell us we're powerless. We're not. They tell us it's too late. It isn't. They tell us we can't win. We can and we will the moment we stand together. How that is to be done is simple but difficult. In its most basic form, it is through communication and activism, and the combining of common sense voices to show the corrupt power establishment that America's real power is on the rise. Trust me, I know, it won't come easy. But in time, they will get the message, and eventually, when enough of us come together, they will yield. I invite you to use PepTalks as your platform and microphone. In the coming months, we'll be announcing exciting and innovative programs and tools to help. We understand that political involvement and activism can be intimidating and overwhelming, so we're working to make it as easy as possible for you to add your voice without sacrificing the everyday life and happiness you seek to enhance. So I urge you to stay tuned and, just as importantly, introduce others to our show. In all the things we'll do, the numbers will matter. Our existence as the CommonSense Majority is a given, but we will continue to be ignored if we don't make our growing numbers clearly visible for all to see. So as we wrap up for today, please remember to go to all our social media pages and subscribe to and follow PepTalks. Like the Pepisodes and our other content every time you see it. Give us your constructive feedback in the comments. And last but not least of all, constantly share our content with your online and in-person networks, adding your personal appeal to join us in this most important and worthwhile endeavor. As always, we want you all to know how much your interest and support means to us. Even as we're still in the early stages of this show's development, finding our voice, as they say, and working hard to grow a following, one viewer or listener at a time. Just knowing that you're out there doing your part is extremely gratifying. So with that, until next time, remember, stay proud, get loud, and keep coming back to PepTalks, America's voice of common sense. Thanks, everybody. I'll see you again real soon.